When I saw my husband standing by the kitchen counter, holding that folded note in his hand, my heart stopped, not from fear of him yelling, but from the fear of what he might read next. His brow furrowed, eyes narrowing as he scanned the handwriting, and I could almost see the words spilling into his mind, reshaping everything he thought he knew about me. "Who wrote this?" he asked, but his voice wasn't angry, it was quiet, too quiet, and that frightened me more than shouting ever could. I reached for the paper, desperate to snatch it away, but he stepped back, clutching it tighter, his knuckles turning pale. I watched his lips move as he read line after line, and every muscle in my body tensed. Yes, he would see the name soon. The one name I hadn't erased, the one mistake I hadn't buried deep enough. That single word would unravel months of secrets. My fingers trembled at my sides, my throat dry as I bit the inside of my cheek, an old nervous habit, one that left a metallic taste in my mouth. The room seemed to tilt, his breathing becoming uneven, harsher, filling the silence between us. Because the truth was, 3 months ago I made a choice. A choice that cracked open a door I never thought I'd walk through, but once I did, there was no going back. And before I tell you everything, before I show you how it all started, tell me, have you ever carried a secret so heavy that it changed the way you breathe, the way you look at the people you love, because deep down, you knew it was only a matter of time before it destroyed you? I used to think my life was steady. Not happy in the way people write about in novels, but steady, predictable, safe. I had been married for so many years that the shape of my husband's shoulders felt as familiar as the outline of the house we lived in. We weren't unhappy. That's the part one always come back to, we weren't unhappy, not really. There were no screaming fights, no slammed doors, no betrayal that I knew of. But somewhere along the line, the warmth between us thinned into something like routine. Mornings became the clink of his coffee spoon against the mug, evenings became the sound of the news murmuring in the background, and I began to feel like part of the furniture, quietly useful, always there, but invisible. I started going to church more often, not out of sudden devotion, but because I thought maybe I could fill whatever had started hollowing me out. There was comfort in the repetition of the prayers, in the hum of voices saying the same words, week after week. And for a while, that was enough, until the new pastor arrived. He was younger than anyone expected, younger than any pastor I'd known, with a voice that carried not just authority but something unpolished, raw. He didn't speak like someone who had read the words 1,000 times. He spoke like someone who believed them, and that made me listen. The first Sunday I saw him, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a strange tightening in my chest, a sharp awareness of myself in that pew, as if I'd been suddenly seen after decades of being blurred out. He looked around the congregation as he spoke, but when his eyes swept past me, it felt like they paused, like they settled just long enough to send a flicker of warmth, or was it discomfort, through me. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the hymns, on the candles flickering in their holders. But the memory of his glance lingered, as if it had pressed into my skin. Over the weeks, his presence became impossible to overlook. It wasn't his looks alone, though there was a freshness in his face that seemed out of place in the old stone church. It was the way he asked questions after service, how he remembered who had been sick the week before, who needed prayers for their children or parents. He noticed things, small things. And noticing, I realized, can be dangerous. At home, my husband would ask about my day, and I'd tell him about errands, about recipes, about the neighbor's dog getting out again. I didn't tell him about the way the pastor's voice stayed in my head long after I left the church, like a melody I couldn't quite shake. I didn't tell him that I had started dressing differently for Sunday mornings, nothing obvious, nothing anyone else would notice, but softer fabrics, a little more care with my hair, like I wanted to feel awake again. I told myself it was harmless. People admire pastors all the time, don't they? People find comfort in them, even in their kindness. But there was something more in the way my thoughts circled back to him when I was folding laundry or stirring soup. Something unsettling. I caught myself wondering what he thought when he looked at me, not just about my faith, but about me as a woman. The thought embarrassed me, and yet it returned again and again. One Tuesday, after morning prayers, I lingered in the kitchen of the church, helping some of the women pack up leftovers from a small gathering. I wasn't expecting him to walk in, sleeves rolled up, carrying a box of fruit. He smiled when he saw me, a quick, genuine smile that felt like sunlight on a cold day. "Could you help me with this?" he asked, nodding toward the counter. His voice was warm, easy. And I did help, my hands brushing against his as we moved the fruit. The moment lasted only seconds, but I felt the brush of skin like a spark, so small but impossible to ignore. Later that evening, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the same fruit he had carried, my husband sitting across from me reading the paper. The silence between us was comfortable, ordinary. But the thought that kept echoing in my mind was not ordinary at all. It was the way the pastor's hand had felt, the curve of his smile, the fact that I hadn't felt that sudden, sharp pull of attention in years. And that realization terrified me. It was around then that I began to notice more. The way his voice dropped slightly when he spoke to me, the way his eyes held mine a fraction longer than with anyone else. Maybe it was my imagination, I told myself, maybe I was building something out of nothing. But it didn't stop the way my stomach tightened each time I saw him. I thought about my marriage, about the years of quiet loyalty, and wondered if this was what loneliness looked like, not a scream, not a betrayal, but a slow fading, a hunger for something you couldn't name. I wondered if my husband noticed the way I had started looking away when he kissed me goodnight, the way I didn't always meet his eyes at breakfast. Or maybe he didn't notice at all. Maybe that was part of the problem. By the time I admitted to myself that something had shifted, it was already too late. The first thread had been pulled, and the whole fabric of my safe, steady life was starting to unravel, one small, quiet moment at a time. The next Sunday felt different from the moment I woke up. I stood longer than usual in front of the wardrobe, running my hand along hangers, not because I wanted to impress anyone, at least that's what I told myself, but because I wanted to feel awake, wanted to feel something. I settled on a soft linen dress, one I hadn't worn in years, and when I caught my reflection in the mirror, I almost didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. There was something in my eyes I hadn't seen for a long time, a trace of nervous anticipation. Church was fuller than usual, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows and scattering colors across the pews. He was already there, standing near the altar, speaking quietly with an older couple. I watched the way he listened, really listened, nodding with that slight tilt of his head, and felt that uncomfortable warmth in my chest again. When he finally looked up and caught my gaze, it was only for a second, but it felt like he had placed a pin in that moment, holding me there. I told myself not to read into it. People look at each other all the time. But even as I lowered my eyes, the memory of his glance stayed. After the service, I stayed behind to help in the church kitchen. The place smelled of tea and sugar, with plates of sliced bread and fruit spread across the counter. The other women chatted around me, voices soft and familiar, but I was half somewhere else, distracted. And then the door opened, and he stepped in. He carried a basket filled with fruit, sunlight behind him like he had walked straight out of the bright morning air. "I thought you could use more," he said, placing the basket on the table. His voice was casual, friendly, but my hands suddenly felt heavy as I reached for the knife to cut the fruit. There was a drowsy quiet in the kitchen after the others drifted off. It was just the two of us, the low hum of the fridge and the clink of the knife against the cutting board. I cut into a ripe melon, the sweet scent filling the room. He stood close enough that I felt the warmth of his sleeve brushing against my shoulder, close enough that every movement seemed magnified. I handed him a plate without thinking, our fingers grazing, and that tiny touch jolted through me like a spark. We spoke about ordinary things, how the flowers in the church garden were late to bloom, how the market had better fruit this week, but beneath the words was something unsaid, something that made my throat dry. I found myself looking at his hands as he reached for the slices, the way his fingers curled around the plate, the faint mark of a scar on his wrist. He leaned closer to pick up a knife, and I felt my breath hitch, as if my own body had betrayed me. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was him. All I know is that one moment we were standing there, with melon slices and teacups between us, and the next, everything narrowed into one unthinking, unplanned act, ***, we kissed ***. It was the briefest thing, a soft, startled press of lips, but it shattered the careful stillness I had built around my life. I pulled back so fast that the knife nearly slipped from my hand. My heart was beating too loudly, I was sure he could hear it. His face was unreadable, surprised, yes, but not apologetic, and that frightened me more than anything. I muttered something about cleaning up, my voice shaking, and he only nodded, stepping back, giving me space. The kitchen suddenly felt too small. I needed air, needed distance. I left as soon as I could, carrying my bag like a shield. The walk home blurred around me, the streets, the voices, the sound of a bus passing, and all I could think about was that single moment, that single mistake. My lips still felt warm, my mind replaying it over and over, as if I could undo it by running it backward in my head. At home, I placed my bag on the table and stood still, listening. The house was quiet, only the ticking clock breaking the silence. My husband was in the living room, the low murmur of the news filling the air. "You're back," he said without looking up, his voice even. I answered, but my voice didn't sound like mine. I moved through the house, opening curtains, folding a blanket, doing everything but sitting down, because sitting down meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. That evening, I set the table, my hands moving automatically, but my mind was elsewhere. I watched my husband cut his bread, the easy familiarity of his movements, and I wondered if he could see it in me, the shift, the fracture. He looked at me once, briefly, and asked, "Everything all right?" And I said yes, too quickly, too simply. He didn't press. When I went to bed that night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The room smelled faintly of laundry detergent and his cologne, scents that used to comfort me but now felt heavy, pressing against my chest. I thought of the kiss, of how easy it had been to cross that line. And I thought of the pastor's face, not in guilt, but in confusion. Was it really him, or was it me? I told myself it would stop here. That it had to stop here. But in the quiet darkness of my bedroom, I couldn't ignore the truth. I didn't want it to stop. The morning after that kiss, everything felt sharper and stranger, as if the world had tilted slightly while I slept. I woke up to the sound of birds outside, the smell of coffee already drifting from the kitchen, and for a few seconds, I let myself believe nothing had changed. But then it hit me, sudden and heavy, the memory of that brief, unplanned moment in the church kitchen. My hand went instinctively to my lips, and I hated that they still felt warm, that a part of me wanted to hold on to that feeling. I moved through the morning like a ghost, pouring cereal, folding laundry, pretending the day was ordinary. My husband sat across from me at breakfast, scrolling through his phone, and asked if I needed anything from the store. I shook my head, grateful he didn't look too closely, grateful he didn't see the storm behind my eyes. He kissed my cheek on his way out the door, a soft, absent gesture, and I felt my stomach twist with guilt. He trusted me completely. And I wasn't sure I deserved it anymore. I told myself I needed to clear my head, to find some space to think. So I drove out to the botanical garden, a place I hadn't visited in years. It was quiet there, almost abandoned that day, with paths overgrown in places and benches covered in damp leaves. The air smelled of wet soil and green things, and I felt myself exhale for what felt like the first time since yesterday. I wandered slowly, my fingers trailing along the rough wooden railing by the pond, my eyes following a stray cat weaving through the tall grass. And then I saw them, rows of melons growing in a section of the garden I'd almost forgotten existed. Their round, heavy shapes sat in the dirt, their pale skins catching the light, and for some reason, I couldn't look away. Something about them felt almost mocking, as if their sweetness was a reminder of what I had already tasted and couldn't untaste. I sat on a bench near the melons, staring without really seeing, trying to convince myself that the kiss meant nothing. That it was a mistake, a brief lapse, something we could both pretend never happened. But my thoughts refused to stay tidy. I kept replaying the way his face had looked when we pulled apart, not shocked enough, not apologetic enough. And that terrified me, because it mirrored how I felt. The sound of footsteps pulled me out of my thoughts. I turned, and there he was, walking toward me, his jacket slung over his arm, as if he belonged here. For a second, I thought I was imagining him. But he smiled, hesitant, unsure, and that smile made the ground feel less steady beneath me. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, stopping a few feet away. Neither did I thought, though my mouth stayed silent. The truth was, I wasn't sure if I had come here to get away from him or to find him. He sat down at the far end of the bench, leaving a space between us, but it felt like no space at all. The air was heavy with unsaid things. We spoke about the garden first, about how he'd been meaning to visit, how peaceful it was compared to town. Our words were simple, harmless on the surface, but I could feel something else running underneath them, a quiet current neither of us wanted to name. He told me he might not be in town for long, that there were plans for further studies, maybe even another parish somewhere far away. He said it lightly, like it didn't matter, but the words hit me like a cold wind. I shouldn't have cared. We barely knew each other, I told myself. But the thought of him leaving made my chest ache in a way that felt embarrassingly deep. I glanced at the melons again, their bright flesh peeking through the leaves. One sat cracked open, ants crawling along its sweetness, and for a reason I couldn't explain, it felt like a metaphor for everything, how something whole could split, how sweetness could spill where it shouldn't. We sat in silence for a long while. I could hear birds, the faint hum of insects, even the distant sound of a gate creaking open somewhere. But between us, there was only that silence, taut and waiting. I wondered if he could hear how uneven my breathing had become. When I finally stood up to leave, he didn't stop me, didn't say anything more. But as I walked away, I felt his gaze on my back, steady and unreadable. The drive home was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, my mind spinning through every word, every look, every moment from that bench. I didn't know what scared me more, that the kiss had happened, or that it had changed me in ways I couldn't undo. By the time I reached my street, I had rehearsed half a dozen explanations in my head, none of them true, all of them useless. When I walked into the house, my husband was at the kitchen counter, slicing bread. He looked up, smiled faintly, and asked if I wanted tea. I nodded, answering automatically, and leaned against the counter, forcing myself to smile back. But inside, I felt split open, like that melon in the garden, sweetness spilling where it didn't belong, and no way to gather it back. The next few days became a strange balancing act, like I was walking a tightrope between two lives. At home, everything looked the same curtains swayed in the kitchen window, the same sound of my husband's shoes on the wooden floor as he came in from work. But inside me, everything felt different. I found myself paying attention to things I had never noticed before, the exact way he held his coffee mug, the pause before he answered a question, even the way he sighed when he sat down after a long day. I was looking for something, maybe proof that he still saw me, but what unsettled me most was that I couldn't tell whether he did. Every evening felt slightly longer. My husband would talk about his day in fragments, traffic on the way home, a coworker's story about their new grandchild, and I would nod, respond, even smile when I should. But I wasn't really there. Part of me was still in the church kitchen, still on that bench in the botanical garden, still stuck in the memory of a kiss I couldn't forget. I wondered if my husband could feel the distance I was creating, a quiet gap widening between us, or if he was too wrapped in his own routine to notice. By Wednesday, I couldn't sit in the house any longer. The silence made my thoughts louder. I told him I was heading to the church to help sort donations for the food drive, and he just nodded, distracted by a sports broadcast on the television. I picked up my keys and left, not sure whether I was running from guilt or toward temptation. The church was nearly empty when I arrived, the echo of my footsteps in the hallway making me feel exposed. The kitchen door was ajar, and I could hear voices inside, the low hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes. I expected to see a few familiar faces, but when I stepped in, I found only him wiping down the counter, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked up, startled but not surprised, and smiled like he'd been expecting me anyway. "You're here early," he said lightly, setting the cloth aside. I wanted to say something ordinary, something safe, but my voice caught. "I thought I'd help," I finally managed, my words sounding too soft, too rehearsed. He nodded, and for a moment, it was just the sound of the faucet and the two of us moving around each other in that narrow kitchen. I tried to focus on the tasks, stacking plates, slicing bread, setting out tea bags, but every movement felt magnified, every brush of proximity electric. On the counter sat a melon, one of the last from the garden, and he reached for the knife to cut it. Watching him, I noticed absurd details, the way his fingers wrapped around the handle, the careful press of the blade through the rind, the sound of the split as the fruit opened. The sweetness filled the air instantly, heavy and familiar, and I felt an ache I couldn't name. We spoke in fragments again, about donations, about next Sunday's schedule, but our words felt like they were covering something deeper, a silence that threatened to spill over. He looked at me once, really looked, and I felt my breath falter. I wondered if I should say something about that kiss, confess it was a mistake, draw a line between us. But I didn't. The words stayed locked in my throat, and the silence between us said more than anything we could have admitted. When I returned home later that evening, my husband was at the kitchen table, reading the mail. He looked up, smiled faintly, and asked, "Long day?" I said yes, placing my bag down, forcing my voice to sound casual. But as I moved through the motions of the night, washing dishes, folding towels, locking the front door, I realized something terrifying. I didn't want to draw that line. Not yet. Not when every glance, every conversation, every shared moment felt like holding my breath and stepping closer to something I couldn't name, something I couldn't stop. The days that followed felt like they belonged to someone else's life, like I was walking through a version of myself I barely recognized. I did all the usual things, laundry, groceries, errands, but every moment was laced with tension, like the air before a storm. My husband went about his routines, and I clung to them, grateful for his predictable movements, yet aware of how those same patterns made me ache. When he kissed my cheek goodnight or brushed past me in the hallway, I felt the ghost of another presence, another kind of closeness I couldn't admit to. I tried to convince myself to stay away, to put distance between myself and the church kitchen, the garden, and him. But telling myself to stop only made me think of him more. I found excuses to go back, offering to help with donations, to tidy hymnals, to bring tea. My reasons sounded good enough out loud, but I knew better. I wasn't going for the work. The afternoon I went to the botanical garden again. It was overcast, the kind of sky that made colors look muted. I told myself I just wanted the quiet, the space to think. But as soon as I stepped through the gate, I knew I was lying to myself. The garden smelled damp, like rain had been there hours ago, and the paths were soft underfoot. I followed the winding trail without much thought, my heart already heavy with expectation. And then I saw him. He was standing by the pond, looking down at the water as if he had been waiting for it to speak. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The space between us was filled with everything we hadn't said before, everything we didn't dare name. I walked toward him, slow but steady, and the closer I came, the louder my heart felt in my chest. When I reached him, we spoke small, ordinary words about the weather, the garden, how quiet it felt. The conversation wasn't remarkable, but the way he looked at me was. There was no attempt to disguise it now, no polite deflection in his eyes. He looked at me like he saw something he wasn't supposed to see, and I couldn't look away. We moved to a bench near the edge of the pond, the wood slick with earlier rain. We sat there, side by side, not touching, but the absence of space felt like its own kind of closeness. I stared at the ripples in the water, trying to focus on anything but the warmth radiating from his presence. He reached out, not for me, just to brush a leaf off the bench, but his hand grazed mine, and I felt the air leave my lungs. I didn't pull away. Neither did he. That small point of contact felt louder than anything we'd said. I turned to him, and in that moment, there were no rehearsed excuses, no quiet promises to stop. There was only the closeness, the heavy pull of it, and before I could think or plan or talk myself out of it, we kissed. It was different this time. The first kiss had been startled, almost accidental, but this one carried intention. It was soft but certain, as if neither of us could pretend anymore. When we pulled apart, I couldn't meet his eyes. My breath was uneven, my hands trembling on my lap. The garden around us was silent except for the faint hum of insects and the distant drip of water from a branch. I told myself I should leave, and eventually I did, standing so quickly I nearly lost my balance. He didn't stop me, didn't speak, just sat there as I walked away. The drive home was quiet, the windshield wipers squeaking once as if testing for rain that never came. I gripped the steering wheel too hard, trying to push down the swell of guilt rising in my throat. When I walked into the house, the kitchen smelled of roasted vegetables, and my husband was humming under his breath as he set the table. He looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "You're home earlier than I thought." I nodded, my voice caught somewhere between truth and silence. I sat down across from him, watching his familiar hands move over plates, and wondered if he could see it in me, the shift, the crack, the weight of something I couldn't undo. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling again, the room dark except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I closed my eyes, but all I could see was the bench, the way his face looked before we kissed, the way mine must have looked after. And for the first time, I didn't tell myself I wanted it to stop. For the first time, I admitted to myself that I didn't want it to. The morning after that second kiss, the house felt both too small and too empty at the same time. I moved around the kitchen, rinsing dishes that didn't need rinsing, wiping the same patch of counter 3 times, anything to keep my hands busy while my mind churned. Every clatter of a plate sounded too loud, every creak of the floor seemed to betray the chaos swirling inside me. My husband sat at the table reading the paper, his coffee steaming in front of him, and I found myself staring at the back of his hands, the familiar shape, the wedding band, the steady way he turned the page. He hadn't changed. The world around me hadn't changed. Only I had, and that difference felt like a weight pressing against my ribs. I told myself I needed to stop thinking about it, to stop letting that kiss replay every time my mind wandered. But the harder I tried to push it away, the more it came back, uninvited, insistent, filling the quiet moments. It wasn't just the kiss itself, it was the look in his eyes before it happened, the certainty that passed between us without a word. That memory lodged in me like a thorn. By mid-morning, I couldn't bear sitting in the house any longer. I pulled on my jacket and said I was going out for groceries, though I didn't need anything. My husband looked up briefly and nodded, distracted, and that simple, easy trust stung more than any question would have. I drove aimlessly for a while, turning down streets without thinking, until I found myself near the church again. The steeple rose against the gray sky, familiar and heavy, and my hands tightened on the steering wheel. I didn't plan to go inside, I told myself I was just passing by, but somehow the car slowed, and then I was parked, stepping out, my breath fogging in the cool air. The kitchen door was open. I could hear faint sounds, someone moving dishes, the low scrape of a chair. I hesitated at the threshold, thinking I should turn back, but my feet carried me in. He was there. Alone again. He looked up when he saw me, and that same quiet recognition passed over his face, like he knew why I had come, even if I didn't have the courage to say it. I wasn't sure if anyone would come by today, he said, his voice even, almost too casual. I told him something about donations, about checking on things. The words felt thin, like paper stretched too far, but he didn't call me on it. We moved around each other in that narrow space, tidying cups, folding dishcloths, our hands brushing now and then, each contact sharp and unavoidable. There was another melon on the counter, one of the last from the garden, its skin pale and smooth. He picked up the knife and sliced into it, and the scent filled the air, sweet, heavy, almost cloying. I stood there, watching, and felt that familiar tug, like everything ordinary in that moment had turned into something I couldn't untangle. I wanted to say something, about what had happened, about the fact that it couldn't keep happening, but my voice stayed silent. And then, before I could find the words, I heard myself ask, almost without thinking, "Are you here tomorrow?" He nodded, and that simple answer held more weight than either of us acknowledged. That evening at home, I stared at my phone for a long time. I typed a message, deleted it, typed it again, deleted it again. Finally, I sent just one sentence, "I'll come by tomorrow." I set the phone down and walked away, as if distance could make the choice feel less real. The reply came quickly. Only 3 words, "I'll be here." I stared at those words until the screen dimmed. They weren't dramatic, they weren't romantic, they weren't anything that could be read aloud without sounding ordinary. But they didn't feel ordinary. They felt like a door opening, one I wasn't sure I could close again. When my husband came into the room, asking what I wanted for dinner, I slipped the phone into my pocket. He didn't notice anything different in my face. He didn't ask why my voice sounded tight when I answered. That night, I lay awake listening to the sound of his breathing beside me, steady and familiar, and I thought about the message, about tomorrow, about what I was moving toward. The ceiling above me was just a shadow in the dark, but it felt like a blank page. I stared at it and realized I was already writing something I couldn't erase. The morning arrived gray and heavy, the kind of sky that looked like it might rain but never quite committed. I woke before the alarm, staring at the ceiling as the first thin light crept into the room. My husband slept beside me, his breathing deep and even, and I lay there listening to it, feeling the weight of what I was about to do settle deeper in my chest. I told myself not to go. I told myself this was the last chance to stop, to turn back. But as I got dressed, choosing clothes without even thinking about them, I knew I wasn't going to stop. I left the house with a casual "I'll run a few errands," and he barely looked up from the paper. The trust in that small gesture hurt in a way I couldn't name. I drove with my hands clenched on the steering wheel, the radio low, my thoughts louder than the hum of the car. Every turn felt deliberate, every mile another line I couldn't uncross. The garden was almost empty when I arrived, the gates creaking as I pushed them open. The paths were slick from last night's rain, and the air smelled of wet earth and leaves. He was already there, standing by one of the benches, his coat draped over the backrest. When he turned and saw me, he didn't look surprised. It was as if both of us had known we would end up here, at this exact place, no matter what we told ourselves before. Neither of us said much at first. Words felt too fragile for what hung in the air. We walked a little along the path, our shoulders close enough to brush but not touching. The sky seemed lower somehow, clouds stretching heavy and unbroken above us. A soft drizzle began, barely more than mist, and we found shelter under the old wooden awning by the side of the path. The bench beneath it was damp but sheltered, and we sat without speaking, the sound of rain filling the space between us. The garden felt sealed off, as though the world had shrunk to this one small corner. He handed me his coat when he noticed my shoulders shiver, and our hands touched in the exchange. I felt the warmth of his fingers even after the coat was on my lap. For a long time we sat there, the drizzle turning to a steadier rain, droplets hitting the awning in a rhythm that felt louder than it should have. I turned to look at him, and he was already watching me. There was no hesitation in that look, no polite barrier left. I felt my breath catch as I realized that every choice I thought I was making had already been made. The bench, the rain, the coat between us, it all blurred. The space we had been holding collapsed, and the moment unfolded without planning, without words, without anything but the quiet inevitability of what had been building for weeks. We spent the night together. When I woke, the rain had stopped. The air was still damp, the kind of damp that clings to your skin and clothes and doesn't let go. I sat up slowly, disoriented by the strange mix of silence and birdsong around us. The garden looked different in the pale early light, like the world had held its breath overnight. He was beside me, his coat folded over the bench, his eyes closed but not quite asleep. I looked at him, at the lines of his face in the dim light, and I felt something I couldn't name, something sharp and soft at the same time. I stood eventually, my legs heavy, my hands trembling as I smoothed my clothes. He opened his eyes, and there was no surprise there, only quiet acknowledgement. Neither of us said much as I stepped out from under the awning, the damp grass soft beneath my shoes. The walk back to the car felt longer than it should have. Every step seemed to echo with the weight of what had happened. When I reached the car, I sat for a long moment before starting the engine, staring at my own hands on the steering wheel, as if they belonged to someone else. The drive home was silent. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't want any noise to fill the space, because the noise was already inside me, an ache, a question, a truth I couldn't push away. When I opened the front door, the house felt too bright, too ordinary. My husband was in the kitchen, humming faintly as he poured coffee. He turned when he heard me, smiled like he always did, and said, "You're home early." I nodded, my throat too tight for words. I set my keys on the counter, the small clatter sounding too loud in the stillness. I watched him move around the kitchen, and the contrast nearly split me in two, the man who trusted me, the man who believed he knew me, and the woman standing in front of him who wasn't sure she knew herself anymore. The day after, everything in the house felt wrong, not because it had changed, but because it hadn't. The kitchen table was still covered in the same small stack of mail, the same bowl of fruit that I had ignored all week. My husband moved around the room with the same ease, humming to himself as he buttered his toast. The familiar smell of coffee filled the air, but instead of comfort, it felt almost suffocating. Every ordinary thing was too sharp, too bright, like the contrast had been turned up on my life. I sat at the table, pretending to read a grocery list, my fingers tracing the edges of the paper, my mind far from the room. Every movement felt like an act, every smile like a performance. I didn't have to lie outright, he didn't ask questions, not really, but the omissions felt heavier than words. The image of the garden clung to me. The slick bench, the rain-soaked air, the feeling of the world narrowing to a single point, it was all there when I closed my eyes. And beneath all of that was the memory of what I'd done, the weight of it like an invisible bruise I couldn't stop pressing on. I tried to lose myself in chores. I cleaned cupboards that didn't need cleaning, wiped counters that were already spotless. I reorganized the pantry, lining up cans by size, as if order on a shelf could bring order inside my head. But nothing settled. The thoughts kept circling, relentless and sharp. I caught myself checking my phone, waiting for a message I didn't even know if I wanted. Part of me hoped he wouldn't reach out, that his silence would force this to fade. Another part, the part one hated, wanted to see his name light up the screen. When a message finally came, it was short, almost too simple. Are you all right? I stared at those words for a long time. There was nothing suggestive in them, nothing incriminating, nothing anyone else would find odd. But I couldn't read them like they were simple. Not anymore. I typed and erased a dozen replies before sending just, I don't know. That afternoon, I walked to the store just to get out of the house, though there was nothing we needed. The aisles felt unreal, too bright, filled with strangers' voices that faded into a dull hum. I bought milk and bread I didn't need and wandered home slowly, hoping that if I stretched the hours, the thoughts might untangle. When I came back, my husband was on the couch, watching an old movie. He looked up and smiled, the same smile I had seen 1,000 times before. There was no suspicion in it, no flicker of doubt, just warmth. It hit me harder than any accusation would have. All evening, I moved through the house like I was underwater. I folded laundry, I set the table, I asked my husband if he wanted more tea. Every task was something to hold on to, a way to keep my hands busy while my mind spun. That night, lying in bed, I stared into the dark and thought about how easy it had been to slip into this. How ordinary each step had seemed, how small. A glance. A smile. A touch. A kiss. And then something bigger, something I couldn't take back. I wondered if guilt was supposed to feel like this, an ache that didn't stop, but also didn't stop me. The weight of it was there, pressing down, but beneath it was something else, something I couldn't name and didn't want to. My husband shifted in his sleep, his arm brushing mine, and I froze at the contact, my breath catching in my throat. He murmured something, still half dreaming, and settled again. I stayed awake, my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, the same thoughts looping until morning crept in again, soft and gray, bringing another day that would look the same but feel entirely different. The church was more crowded than usual that Sunday, the air filled with the rustle of coats and the shuffle of shoes on the worn wooden floor. I walked in later than I meant to, sliding into a pew near the back, hoping that if anyone looked, they would see only another parishioner finding her seat. But my heart was beating faster than it should, and I could feel a nervous warmth creeping up my neck as I caught sight of him at the front. He stood behind the lectern, his voice calm, his hands steady, and to anyone else, he must have seemed exactly as he always did. But for me, the sight of him was like touching a bruise, sharp, familiar, and impossible to ignore. I thought I could focus on the service, lose myself in the familiar rhythms of prayer and song, but every word he spoke felt heavier, like it carried a meaning meant only for me. When he spoke about forgiveness, about the weight we carry and the ways we seek to lay it down, my chest tightened. It was just another sermon. I knew that. But I couldn't hear it like everyone else. After the service, people gathered in small groups, chatting in low voices, the smell of tea drifting from the kitchen. I stayed at the edge of the crowd, unsure if I should leave or linger. My husband hadn't come that morning, he rarely did anymore. I told myself that was why I stayed, that I was only helping, only tidying. But I knew better. In the kitchen, the counters were already lined with plates of bread and bowls of fruit. Someone had brought a melon again, its sweet scent thick in the warm air. I stared at it for a moment too long, remembering every other time that smell had filled the room, the weight of every choice that had led me here. He came in while I was slicing bread, and for a moment, it felt like the room shrank. His voice was even when he greeted me, his hands busy as he set down a box of mugs, but our eyes met for a second too long, and in that glance, everything unspoken felt louder than words. We kept our voices low, talking about practical things, the schedule for next week, which cupboards still needed organizing. But under every word, there was another conversation happening, silent and heavy. I felt the sting of guilt more sharply than before. Maybe it was the sermon about forgiveness still echoing in my head, or the fact that the room was full of people who trusted us both. Every time someone walked past the doorway, I felt my pulse jump, as if every passing shadow might see too much. I tried to busy my hands, arranging dishes, pouring tea, avoiding looking at him too often. But I could still feel him there, close enough that the air between us seemed charged. And that made the guilt worse, not better. When I finally stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap. I stood on the church steps for a moment, clutching my bag, my breath clouding in front of me. The street was quiet, just a few people walking away, their coats pulled tight. I should have felt relief at leaving the building, at putting distance between us, but instead, I felt hollow. The words from the sermon echoed in my mind, about forgiveness, about the burden of secrets, and I wondered if I even knew what forgiveness would look like anymore. The drive home felt longer than it should have, the road stretching out in front of me in an endless gray ribbon. I gripped the steering wheel too tightly, my knuckles pale, my thoughts circling the same questions without answers. At home, my husband was in the kitchen, humming as he rinsed dishes. He looked up when I walked in and smiled, that same easy, untroubled smile that now felt almost unbearable. He asked how the service was, and I said good, my voice steady though my heart wasn't. I set my bag on the counter and busied myself with the kettle, pretending the clink of cups and the rush of water could drown out the thoughts pressing against me. But even in that quiet, with the ordinary sounds of home all around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted forever, and that the weight of it was only beginning to settle. The next morning the garden felt farther away than ever, like it belonged to another life entirely. But the weight of what happened there didn't fade, it pressed down harder, sharper, every time I glanced at the ordinary things around me. The breakfast table, the folded newspaper, the hum of the refrigerator, each of them reminded me that the world I had always known was still here, steady and unchanged, even as I had quietly dismantled it piece by piece. I found myself drifting through the house that day, touching things just to prove they were still real, the corner of the kitchen counter, the frame of the bedroom door, the edge of the dining table where the varnish had worn away. My husband moved easily around me, asking about errands, about dinner, about nothing in particular, and his voice was warm and familiar. I answered when I had to, but most of my words felt like echoes, hollow and weightless. At some point, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. I paused, staring at the reflection like it belonged to someone else. My face looked the same lines, same faint tiredness around the eyes, but there was something there I couldn't name. Something restless. Something guilty. Something I didn't know how to carry. I told him I was going for a walk, that I needed air. He nodded, distracted, and I left, the door clicking softly behind me. The air outside was cold and still, the kind that made your breath come out in small clouds. I walked without thinking, following familiar streets, past the same houses, the same hedges, the same stretch of fence where ivy had grown wild. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the botanical garden that I realized where my feet had taken me. The gates were half open, creaking slightly in the wind, and I stepped through before I could decide whether to turn back. The garden was quiet. Too quiet. The paths were damp from last night's rain, the air heavy with the smell of earth. I followed the trail toward the bench where we had sat before, each step slower than the last, my heart heavy with things I wasn't ready to say. The bench was empty. Of course it was. But sitting there felt unavoidable. I lowered myself onto the worn wood and looked around. The garden felt unchanged, just plants, trees, and the faint sound of a bird in the distance, but everything about it felt different to me now. A melon sat on the edge of the plot nearby, overripe, its skin cracked, its sweetness spilling out into the dirt. Ants crawled across it, and for a reason I couldn't explain, the sight caught in my throat. That melon, ruined and open, was the perfect image for how I felt, split, exposed, unable to gather myself back. I thought about him, about the way he'd looked at me that day under the awning, about the silence between us afterward. He hadn't promised anything. Neither had I. But I knew the choice I'd made couldn't be unmade, and sitting there on that bench, I felt both the fullness and the emptiness of it. Time moved strangely as I sat there. I wasn't sure how long I stayed, minutes, an hour, maybe more. The garden didn't care. The leaves shifted in the breeze, the distant hum of the city barely reached this far. Eventually, I stood. My knees felt stiff, my hands cold from resting too long in my lap. I walked back down the path, past the melon plot, past the closed-up greenhouse, and through the gate. The drive home was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't roll down the window. I just let the silence stretch, the road unspooling in front of me like a thread leading back to the life I wasn't sure I knew how to return to. When I walked through the front door, the smell of something baking filled the house. My husband was in the kitchen, humming faintly as he took a tray from the oven. He looked up when he saw me, smiling without a trace of suspicion, and asked, "Did you have a good walk?" I nodded, my throat too tight for words. I put my keys on the counter, the small clink sounding too loud in the stillness. He kept humming, the sound soft and familiar, and I stood there, hands resting on the edge of the counter, feeling the weight of everything I hadn't told him. I wanted to speak. To say something. Anything. But no words came. Instead, I stayed silent, the house warm around me, the garden still in my mind, and the quiet realization sinking in that my life, our life, would never feel untouched again.